to the gem of the Supreme Buddha. The Buddha is my refuge every day. My homage to the gem of the Supreme Dhamma. The Dhamma is my refuge every day. My homage to the gem of the Supreme Sangha. The Sangha is my refuge every day. My homage to the Supreme Triple Gem. The Triple Gem is my refuge every day. Namo Buddhaya. Meritorious disciples, we are very fortunate. We are very fortunate because we have the opportunity to hear a Dhamma that's sublime, that's the most rare to hear in this world. That is, we have the opportunity now to hear the Supreme Buddha's noble teaching, the Dhamma. Meritorious disciples, when we hear this Dhamma, the Blessed One explains, there is something that we must do. That is, when we hear the Dhamma, we must engage in wise consideration. What should we do? We must engage in wise consideration. The Blessed One explains that out of all internal things in this world, I do not see anything that leads to greater good than wise consideration. So that means, meritorious disciples, out of internal things, that means things that belongs to us, out of things that we can do ourselves, there is nothing greater that leads to our benefit than engaging in wise consideration. Wise consideration refers to thinking according to the Dhamma, according to the teaching of the Supreme Buddha. Meritorious disciples, if we do not engage in wise consideration, then there is no way that we can get wisdom, develop wisdom. The Supreme Buddha explains this Dhamma is for the wise, not for the unwise. Panyavantasaya Dhammo Nayan Dhammo Dupanyasa. This Dhamma is for the wise, not for the unwise. So if we do not engage in wise consideration, we are not able to develop our wisdom. And if we do not develop our wisdom, then we are not able to realize, understand a great teacher's noble Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explains, O monks, both you and I have traveled this far in this samsara because we were not able to realize the Four Noble Truths. We weren't able to realize suffering. We weren't able to realize the cause of suffering. We weren't able to realize that it is indeed possible to be free from all these suffering. And we weren't able to realize the last noble truth, the path leading to suffering. Meritorious disciples, it is through wisdom that we can understand these Four Noble Truths. The Supreme Buddha explains, birth is suffering, having to age, having to become sick is suffering, having to die is suffering, having to become separated from our loved ones is suffering, and having to get together with people we don't like is also suffering. It's suffering, isn't it? And at the end, the Blessed One explains, in brief, these 5 aggregates of clinging is suffering. Sankittena Panchupadana Kanda Dukkha. In brief, these 5 aggregates of clinging is suffering. So today, meritorious disciples, we're going to learn about the 5 aggregates of clinging. today we're going to learn the sutta called Phena Pindupama, which is found in the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon. Phena Pindupama means a lump of foam. So the Supreme Buddha explains this sutta by using similes. The Supreme Buddha explains, so at that time the Supreme Buddha was staying at Ayodhya. Ekang samayam bhagava ayujjayang viharati gangaya nadya tire. So on that occasion, the Supreme Buddha was staying at Ayodhya near the river Ganges. At that time, the Supreme Buddha showed the bhikkhus, the monks, the river Ganges and said, "O bhikkhus, look at that river. Look at all those lumps of foam in that river." What did the Supreme Buddha show? The Supreme Buddha showed the bhikkhus there the lumps of foam in the river. Now, meritorious disciples, in India, rivers are very wide and large and they flow very fast. So as a result, there's a lot of foam that's deposited on the rivers. So during this sutta, the Supreme Buddha uses those foam as a simile. The Blessed One explains, bhikkhus, suppose there is all these foam in this river Ganges, and there is a person with eyesight, a person with sight. That means a person who can see well. The Blessed One explains, when a person with sight looks at this foam, these lumps of foam, when he looks at it carefully, when he ponders, and when he analyzes it, investigates it, he realizes that this foam is empty, it's void. He realizes that there is no substance in it. So meritorious disciples, at that time, the Supreme Buddha showed the monks the foam that was deposited on the river. And the Supreme Buddha explains, "O monks, suppose there is a great lump of foam in this river Ganges, and a person with good sight looks at this foam, this lump of foam, and he thinks about it. He thinks about it and he ponders it. He contemplates on it. And he tries to analyze it. He tries to investigate it thoroughly. So what is the person with good eyesight doing? The Blessed One explains, he sees this foam that's on the river, and he's a person with good sight. So this person with good sight thinks about the foam. He ponders it. He tries to investigate it thoroughly. So meritorious disciple, this is a very good point. The Blessed One is trying to explain to us something very important here. Here the Supreme Buddha is referring to this person as a person with good sight. Now here the Blessed One means this is a person who's wise. He's able to think. So because he's wise, when he sees the foam, when he looks at the foam, what does he do? Yes, he thinks about it, he ponders it, and he investigates it thoroughly. And the Blessed One explains, when he does so, that means when he sees the foam and he thinks about it, ponders it, and when he investigates it thoroughly, he realizes that this foam is void, that it's empty. He realizes that there is nothing substantial in it. He realizes that it's hollow. So what is the Supreme Buddha explaining here? When a person who's wise looks at the foam, he realizes that it's void, that it's hollow, that it's insubstantial. The Supreme Buddha explains, King hisya bhikkhave Phena Pindupama. O monks, for what substance is there in this lump of foam? Now, meritorious disciples, when we see a lump of foam, it looks from afar as if it's very beautiful. It looks like soft cotton from afar. But when we get closer to it, when we investigate it thoroughly, what do we realize? What do we understand? We understand that there's nothing inside. Foam is empty. There's only air in it. There is nothing substantial in it, isn't it? So the Supreme Buddha explains, when a wise person investigates it thoroughly, he realizes that it's empty, that that foam is hollow. The Blessed One explains, for what substance is there in this foam? And then, meritorious disciple, the Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, just the same are forms in the past, forms in the future. Blessed One explains, Evameva ko bhikkhave yankinchi rupam atita anagata pachupanna. So too bhikkhus are forms in the past, in the future, and in the present. Ajatangva bahiddhava, forms that are internal and external to you. Olarikangva sukumangva, subtle or gross. Hinangva panitangva, inferior forms or superior forms. Yandure santikeva, whether those forms are near or far. The Blessed One explains, when a person looks at forms, when a person who has good sight looks at forms and investigates it, when he thinks about it, ponders it, and investigates it thoroughly, he realizes that these forms are void, are hollow, and that there is nothing substantial in it. The Blessed One explains, King hisya bhikkhave rupe saro, for what substance is there, meritorious bhikkhus, in these forms? Now, meritorious disciples, what is form? Here the word form refers to a material entity that is made up of the four great elements. That is, our body is form. It's made of the four great elements, that is, the earth element, the water element, the air element, and the fire element. Our body is made up of these four elements. And all things that are external to us, all objects that are material, that's external to us, are also made up of these four great elements. Now, if we take our body for an example, it's made of the earth element. As a result, when this body dies, and when we bury it, what happens to the body? It decays and it turns into earth. Because all these body parts, this hair in our body, the skin, these eyes, all of these things are considered being part of the earth element. These nails, these teeth, they're all considered earth element. And so when we die and when the body is buried, what happens? The earth element joins the earth. It decays. And if there are parts in the body that are liquidy, that are like liquid, for example, our blood, what happens to that part? It joins the water. It becomes part of the water. And the air inside, the air we inhale and exhale, the air in our stomach, that air element becomes part of air. And if there was a certain heat in our body, what happens to that heat? Upon death, that heat becomes part of heat. So the Supreme Buddha explains this form is made up of these four great elements, and as a result, when the body dies, when we pass away, this body disperses. So the Supreme Buddha explains, as a result, this body has nothing inside. It's hollow, it's empty, there's nothing substantial in the body. Now, meritorious devotees, if we look at our past, the form we had in the past, that means our body in the past changed, isn't it? What we had in the past changed, and our body now is different. For example, in our youth, the way we looked is different, and by middle age, we look different. And then as we age, what happens to this body? It changes, it becomes impermanent, and with death, this body disperses, isn't it? So the Supreme Buddha explains all these forms are impermanent. There is nothing substantial in it. There is no essence in it. The Supreme Buddha explains, a person who contemplates on this fact realizes the emptiness in all these forms, not just our body, also the bodies of others. That's why the Blessed One explains forms in the past, in the future, and in the present, internal forms, external forms, and also gross and subtle forms, and superior and inferior forms, and forms far and near. They all change, they all decay, and they all become impermanent. That's why the Supreme Buddha explained, Rupatitiko bhikkhave tasma rupanti uchati. Rupa, form, is referred to as form because it changes, it gets destroyed, it decays. The Supreme Buddha explains, a person who looks at this body or this material entity wisely realizes that there's really nothing substantial in this body. Now look at all the bodies we had in the past, in previous lives. Where are they now? They changed, they decayed. And if we were to have a body in the future, what would happen? That body would also be made up of the four great elements, and with time it will change, decay, and become part of earth, water, heat, and air, isn't it? So the Supreme Buddha explains these forms have nothing substantial, it's hollow, it's empty, and a person who investigates it properly realizes this. Now, meritorious disciples, the Supreme Buddha explains, this form that we call our body, for example, it's maintained through nutriments, through nutritious food. If we do not eat for a week, what would happen to this body? It would become sick, and what would happen? If we do not have the right nutrients, this body would die, isn't it? So the Supreme Buddha explains this body exists as a result of nutriments. And so this body is conditioned through nutriments, and when that condition ceases to exist, this body decays and it dies. So the Supreme Buddha explains, when you really investigate this form, this material body, you realize the reality of this body, you realize there is really nothing in this body that we can call I, me, or mine. We cannot control this body the way we want, can we? When it ages, we cannot stop its aging. When it falls sick, we cannot stop it. And when it dies, we cannot stop it. We're not in control of this body. No, meritorious disciples. There's a beautiful story that really explains this. King Bimbisara had a beautiful queen named Khema. And so at that time, she had heard that the Supreme Buddha insults this body. Now Khema, Queen Khema, was a very beautiful person. She was very pleased with her beauty. So she didn't want to hear anyone insulting this body, saying anything bad about the body. But one day, because of her fortune, because of her merit, she went to see the Supreme Buddha. She went to see the Jetavana Grove because she heard that the park was very beautiful. But of course, when she went into the grove, she had no choice but to go and visit the Supreme Buddha. And so when she went, people had to drag her because she didn't want to go, because she thought when she goes in front of the Supreme Buddha would start to insult this body. But when she went to see the Supreme Buddha, what she saw was something very different. She saw a beautiful maiden fanning the Supreme Buddha. Now when she saw this, she was so surprised, she was awed. And she compared that maiden's beauty with her own. She looked at her hair. Oh, her hair is beautiful, it's long. It's more beautiful than my hair. Oh, look at her eyes, it's blue, it's so beautiful. Look at her body. So she was admiring the body. Now this was the psychic power that the Supreme Buddha was displaying to show Khema the reality of this body, to show Khema the reality of form, rupa. So because of the Supreme Buddha's psychic power, the Supreme Buddha manipulated it such that that maiden would age little by little. So now Khema is staring at that beautiful body, and Khema sees this body aging. That beautiful black hair is changing little by little. The skin is wrinkling little by little. And little by little, her back is hunching, and little by little, she started to shiver, and at the end, she fell down and died. Now, upon seeing this, Khema realized that this body changes, it decays and it dies. She understood the reality. She thought, if that's the reality of that body, then my body is the same. The same thing will happen to this body. She understood the impermanence of the body. She realized there's nothing substantial in this body, that it's hollow, that it's empty. There's nothing we can call I, me, or mine in this body. She understood the internal form, she understood the external form. And so at that time, she went back home and she told King Bimbisara that she wants to become ordained. And she got ordained and became an Arhan Bhikkhuni. She was the wisest bhikkhuni of all bhikkhunis in the Supreme Buddha's dispensation. Now, meritorious disciples, look at the way Queen Khema understood the reality of form. The moment she started to engage in wise consideration, contemplate, investigate it thoroughly, she was able to understand the reality. That's why here the Supreme Buddha explains only a person who has sight, that means a person who is wise, a person who contemplates, who thinks about it, who investigates properly, can realize the reality of forms. The Supreme Buddha explains that these forms are impermanent, changes, it decays. There's nothing to call I, me, or mine in this. It's hollow, it's empty. The Blessed One explains, realize the reality of these forms, whether internal, external, whether forms in the past, present, or future, superior or inferior, gross or subtle, whether the forms are far away or whether the forms are near, they're all hollow, empty. The Blessed One explains, you must understand this reality. Meritorious disciples, next the Supreme Buddha explains to us the second simile to teach us about the second aggregate of clinging. The Supreme Buddha explains, because suppose during autumn, when great rains pour, when the raindrops fall onto the surface of the water, it gives rise to water bubbles. The Supreme Buddha explains, when a person with good sight looks at these bubbles, when he ponders, when he investigates thoroughly, he realizes these water bubbles to be hollow, empty. He realizes these water bubbles to be insubstantial. The Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, for what substance is really there in these water bubbles? Now, meritorious disciples, if we take a look at water bubbles, for example, when the water drops onto the surface of the water, water bubbles arise. And in seconds, they burst. And another bubble arises, and it bursts. So in this way, water bubbles arise, they change, and they burst. It's always changing. The Supreme Buddha explains, when a person looks at these bubbles carefully, he realizes them to be hollow, void, insubstantial. The Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, so too are feelings. Yakachi vedana, atita anagata pachupanna. Whether those feelings were in the past, future, or present. Ajattang wa bahiddang, whether feelings that are internal to us or external to us. Olarika wa sukumama, whether those are gross feelings or subtle feelings. Hina wa panita wa, whether they're inferior feelings or superior feelings. Yandure santikewa, whether those feelings are far away from us or whether those feelings are near us. The Supreme Buddha explains, when a person with good sight looks at it, ponders it, investigates it thoroughly, he realizes that feelings are hollow, are empty, are void, are insubstantial. Now, meritorious disciples, what are feelings? Yes, feelings are threefold. We have pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, and neutral feelings. So the Supreme Buddha explains all these feelings are hollow, empty. Now if we take a look at all the feelings that we felt in this life, where are they now? There were times where we had happy feelings, isn't it? There were times where we were overjoyed. There were times where we thought, where we wished that may this happiness never end. But where is that happiness now? Where is that pleasure now? It's disappeared, isn't it? And at the same time, there were times where we had displeasure. There were times where we had unhappy feelings, sad feelings, feelings that arise from heartbreak, where we couldn't bear the pain. At times when we fall sick, at times where we have to separate from our loved ones. There are many times in our life that we have to go through so much pain, and as a result we feel displeasure. But where are those feelings now? They disappeared, isn't it? They became impermanent. And of course there were times where we had neutral feelings. The Supreme Buddha explains all these feelings are hollow. They arise as a result of contact. That is, when our eyes, forms, and the eye consciousness coincides, it gives rise to contact. And through contact arises feelings, whether pleasure, displeasure, or neutral feelings. And the same thing for the rest of our sense faculties. When we hear sounds, we get feelings. When we smell odors, we get feelings. When we taste food, we get feelings. In this way, through our sense faculties, we get feelings. And the Supreme Buddha explains all these feelings change. They're just like water bubbles. There's nothing permanent in them. It's void, it's empty, and it's hollow. Meritorious disciples, the Supreme Buddha explains next the third simile. Suppose that there is a shimmering mirage during the hot season. What is the Supreme Buddha saying? O bhikkhus, suppose that there's a shimmering mirage during the hot season, in the high afternoon. The Supreme Buddha explains, when a person with good sight looks at this mirage, when he ponders it, contemplates it, investigates it thoroughly, he realizes that this mirage is hollow, it's empty, it's insubstantial. The Blessed One explains, O bhikkhus, what's really the essence of these perceptions? So what did the Supreme Buddha use to explain perception? Which simile? The Supreme Buddha used the simile of a mirage to explain perception. The Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, just like a mirage is this third aggregate of clinging, perception. Now, meritorious disciples, if we really think about what a mirage is, from afar we see as if there's water there, but when we get closer to it, there is no water there. It's empty, it's hollow. And from that point, when we look afar during the dry season, we see the mirage. We see as if there's water afar. And again we go there, and when we go there, we don't find any water. The Supreme Buddha explains, so too bhikkhus, as perception. The Blessed One explains, Yakachi sanya atita anagata pachupanna, whether the perceptions were in the past, in the future, or the present, ajatangwa bahidangwa, whether internal or external, subtle or gross, inferior or superior, whether those perceptions are far away or near us. When a person with good sight, that means a wise person, looks at the perception, the reality of perception, he realizes that it's hollow, that it's void, that it's empty, that it's insubstantial. The Supreme Buddha explains, King is ya bhikkhave sanyaya saro, for what substance is there bhikkhus in perception? Now, meritorious disciples, perception is also conditioned by contact. When the eye, the form, and the consciousness of the eye coincides, it gives rise to contact. And through contact arises perception. We perceive forms, we perceive sounds, we perceive smells, odors, we perceive different tastes, we perceive different tactile sensations, and we perceive thoughts. The Supreme Buddha explains all these are empty, hollow, there's no substance in these. Now if we take an example, what happened to all the perceptions in the past? In our childhood, we perceived different things. We perceived toys, dolls, cars. That's what we perceived. That was our world. And then as we got older, we perceived different things. We perceived different forms, different sounds, beautiful sounds. And we went after delicious food, and we went looking for good sensations. Our perceptions change, and then as we grow older, the same thing happens. Perceptions change. What we perceived in the past is not the way we perceive now. And what we perceive now is not the way we are going to perceive in the future. It changes. Perception is conditioned by contact. When contact changes, perceptions change. Now if we take an example, when we first meet a person, we perceive that person as a good person. But with time, that person changes and we perceive that person as a bad person. What happened? Perception changed. When contact changes, perception changes, isn't it? Meritorious disciples, the Supreme Buddha explains, we came in this samsara because of deformations of perceptions. We took things that are impermanent, we perceive things that are impermanent as permanent. Anicca nitya sanya, perception, meritorious disciples, in Pali is called sanya. So anicca nitya sanya, we perceive things that are impermanent as permanent. Asubhe subha sanya, we perceive things that are foul as unfoul, as attractive and pleasant. Anatyata sanya, we perceive things that are selfless as having a self. The Supreme Buddha explains, because of these deformations of perception, we came thus far in this samsara. The Supreme Buddha explains, all these perceptions are deformed, but now we have the chance to correct the way we perceive. We have the ability to look at what's foul as foul. We have the ability to perceive what's impermanent as impermanent. And we have the opportunity now to see what's selfless, to perceive what's selfless as selfless. The Supreme Buddha explains all these perceptions arise through contact, and with the change of contact, these perceptions change. The Blessed One explains these perceptions are empty, hollow, insubstantial. There's nothing that we can take as I, me, or mine in this. It changes. And then the Supreme Buddha explains the fourth simile. The Supreme Buddha explains, monks, suppose a person who's looking for heartwood, a person who's in search for heartwood, takes an axe and goes into the forest. And there, in the forest, he finds banana trees. And so when he sees the banana trees, he would cut the tree down, and he tries to find heartwood inside these banana trees. The Supreme Buddha explains, when a person with good sight looks at this, observes it, ponders it, investigates thoroughly, he realizes that it's empty, that it's hollow, that it's insubstantial. The Supreme Buddha explains, when that wise person engages in wise consideration, he realizes these banana trees to be hollow, empty, and insubstantial. The Blessed One explains, O bhikkhus, what substance is there in these banana trees? Now, as you know, meritorious disciples, banana trees don't have heartwood in it. It's a bunch of coils, and when you unwind those coils, there is no heartwood in it. So no matter how many banana trees a person cuts down, he's not able to find heartwood, because banana trees don't have a core. There's no core in them. There's no heartwood. The Supreme Buddha explains, Evameva ko bhikkhave yeketi sankhara atita anagata pachupanna, so too bhikkhus are sankhara, volitional formations, whether they were in the past, whether in the future, or in the present. Bahidava, ajjattang wa bahidava, internal or external, subtle or gross, far away or near. All volitional formation, when a wise person engages in wise consideration, investigates properly, ponders, he realizes that all volitional formations are hollow, empty, and insubstantial. Now, meritorious disciples, what are volitional formations? Sankhara. Sanskara, what are they? The Supreme Buddha explains volitional formations is also known as kamma. Intentionally, we do things through our body, speech, and mind, and kamma accumulates. The Supreme Buddha explains this kamma that we accumulate is hollow, empty, is insubstantial. Now, meritorious disciples, think about our life. In childhood, willingly we do many things through our body, speech, and mind. We go to school, we study, we face exams. We do all those intentionally, willingly. And when we do those things intentionally through our body, speech, and mind, karma accumulates. And then as we grow up, we find a job, we get married, and during all those times, we use our body, speech, and mind to do things. Supreme Buddha explains, all these things are hollow. Now, if we look back at our life, where are all the things that we did in the past? They have become impermanent, isn't it? When we look back at our life, everything we did through our body, speech, and mind, the karma we accumulated, has become impermanent. We no longer have those things that we did. They have changed. They have become impermanent. Then, at the end of our life, what we do is, when we are not satisfied in this life, we wish for another life. We think, just like that person who went looking for heartwood in banana trees, no matter how many banana trees he cut down, he's not going to find heartwood, because there is no heartwood in banana trees. Just like that, the Supreme Buddha explains. Although we try to find an essence in this life, and in trying to do so, we willingly do things. We accumulate karma. And when we are not satisfied with the things we do, with the things we get, then we wish in the next birth, may I have this, may I have that. And in this way, from one birth to another, we are going from one birth to another, looking for an essence. But the Blessed One explains, just like there is no heartwood in banana trees, there is no essence in volitional formations. Volitional formations arise through contact. When contact changes, volitional formations changes. They change. The Supreme Buddha explains, volitional formations are impermanent. They change. Next, the Supreme Buddha explains, suppose a magician or an apprentice would display a magical illusion at a crossroad, and a person with good sight comes here and he watches it carefully. He ponders, he investigates it thoroughly, and when he does so, he realizes that that illusion is empty, it's void, it's hollow, that it's insubstantial. The Supreme Buddha explains, Kinghisya bhikkhave maya saro, or because for what substance is there in that magical illusion? Now, meritorious disciple, this is a very good point. The Supreme Buddha is explaining, a magician is displaying a magic, an illusion, at a crossroads. At a crossroad. So that means a person can watch the magician from all four sides. The Blessed One explains, when a wise person looks at this carefully, investigates it carefully, he understands that magical illusion to be hollow. Now look at the accuracy of this simile. The Supreme Buddha explains, the Supreme Buddha uses this simile to explain consciousness, the fifth aggregate of clinging. The Supreme Buddha explains, Evameva ko bhikkhave yankinchi viññānaṁ atitana agata paccupannam. O bhikkhus, so too is consciousness, whether in the past, future or present, internal consciousness or consciousness that's external to us, subtle or gross, superior or inferior, or consciousness far away or near. The Supreme Buddha explains, when a person with wisdom looks at consciousness carefully, ponders it, and engages in wise consideration, he realizes that consciousness is hollow. He realizes that it's void, hollow, and insubstantial. Now, meritorious disciples, what is consciousness? Consciousness in Pali is known as viññāna. The Blessed One explains, viññāna, consciousness, is conditioned by nama-rupa, mentality and materiality. The Supreme Buddha explains, this consciousness is conditioned by mentality and materiality. And with the cessation of mentality and materiality, consciousness ceases. The Blessed One explains, Vijnānātīti ko bhikkhave tasmā viññānanti uchchati. Consciousness means cognizing. When we see forms, we cognize the forms. That means we know the form. When we hear sounds, we cognize the sound. When we smell odors, we cognize the odor. And this cognition or this consciousness arises as a result of mentality and materiality. And with the changing of mentality and materiality, consciousness changes. So the Supreme Buddha explains, this consciousness is just like a illusion. The Supreme Buddha explains, this consciousness makes us think as if there is an I, me or mine, because it's an illusion. In reality, there is no I, me or mine, but because of viññāna, because of consciousness, we cognize it as if there is an I, me or mine. We think as if there is an I, me or mine. We think as if there's a self in this body. In this body, or body is external to us. This illusion, the Supreme Buddha uses the simile of a magical illusion to explain consciousness. So the Supreme Buddha explains, when a person carefully looks at consciousness, he realizes, he understands that this consciousness changes, that it's hollow, that it's void, that it's insubstantial. There is no essence, there is no I, me or mine in this. Who realizes this? A person who looks at consciousness, who contemplates, who engages in wise consideration, a person who investigates it thoroughly. The Supreme Buddha explains, consciousness is just like a magical illusion. Meritorious disciples, next the Supreme Buddha explains, so far the Supreme Buddha explained the 5 aggregates of clinging using 5 similes, isn't it? The Supreme Buddha then explains, when a person evam passam bhikkhave sutava arya savako rupasmin, when a noble disciple looks at forms, feelings, perceptions, volitional formations, and consciousness through his wisdom, he realizes the reality of those 5 aggregates of clinging. He understands the truth about the 5 aggregates of clinging. He realizes that these 5 aggregates of clinging that we call I, me, and mine, these 5 aggregates of clinging that we take as I, as having a self, that wise, noble disciple realizes that it's impermanent, that it's hollow, empty, and that there is nothing inside, there is no core, there is no essence in these 5 aggregates of clinging. And when that person realizes this, that means when he understands the reality, he feels disenchantment. He feels detached from these 5 aggregates of clinging through understanding the reality of these 5 aggregates. Nibbindang virajyate. When he feels disenchanted, he feels dispassion. He no longer clings to it. He no longer craves it. Viraga vimucchiti. And from dispassion, he finds liberation. And he realizes that he became free from those 5 aggregates of clinging. The Blessed One explains, Kina jati, he realizes that he put an end to birth. Usitam brahmacharyang, he realizes that he completed this path to Nibbana. Katang karaniyang naparang ittattaya dipajanati, he realizes what had to be done is done. That means he completed the path to Nibbana. And he realizes that there's nothing more to be done. So the Supreme Buddha explains to us this hollowness, the emptiness of these 5 aggregates of clinging. And the Supreme Buddha uses beautiful verses to describe the emptiness of these 5 aggregates. The Blessed One explains, Phena Pindupamang rupang Vedanang bubbulupama Marichikupama sanya Sankhara kadalupama Mayupam mancha vinyanang Dipatati cha bandhuna. The Supreme Buddha explains, this form is just like a lump of foam. Feeling is just like water bubbles, it changes. And perception is just like a shimmering mirage. And volitional formations are just like banana trees. There is no heartwood to be found, there is no essence in it. And consciousness is an illusion. So says the Supreme Buddha. Yatha yathanan nijjhayati yonisopa parikkati ritthakanto chakang hoti yonang passati yoniso. And however a person engages in wise consideration, he realizes it to be hollow, empty, and insubstantial. Yoimang kayang garaihang bhuri panyena desitang pahanatinang dhammanang rupam paseta jadditang. And with reference to this body, when one engages in deep wisdom, he realizes that with the abandoning of 3 things, this body, this form, gets discarded. Ayusma cha vinyanang yada kaya jahintamang apaviddho tadaseti parabhattang acetanang. When vitality, heat, and consciousness depart from this physical body, then it lies just casting away, becoming food for animals without any volition in it. The Supreme Buddha explains, Etha disayang santano mayayang balalapini vadako eso akhato saro ettana vijjati. The Blessed One explains, this is how we continued in this samsara. This 5 aggregates of clinging is an illusion. It's something that's only praised by the unwise. But the wise person realizes that these 5 aggregates of clinging is like a murderer who's destroying us. And he realizes the hollowness of the 5 aggregates of clinging. Evam bandhe avikya bhikkhu aradhviryo divavaya divarati sampajano patisato. So a bhikkhu, with energy aroused, looks at these 5 aggregates of clinging carefully, and he makes an effort day by day to realize the reality of these 5 aggregates of clinging with ardent effort. Pajahe sabba sanyogam kareya saranathano chareya ditta sisocha patayang achyutam padanti. And when such a bhikkhu looks at the 5 aggregates of clinging in this way, he lets go of all bondages and he makes himself a refuge. And just like a person whose head is ablaze tries to extinguish that fire, he tries his best to attain Nibbana, to realize the Dhamma, which is the deathless state. So in this way, meritorious disciples, the Supreme Buddha in beautiful verses explains the emptiness of these 5 aggregates of clinging. So meritorious disciples, we traveled thus far in this samsara because we weren't able to understand the reality of these 5 aggregates of clinging: Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, Vijnana. That is, form, feelings, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. We took these 5 aggregates of clinging as I, me, and mine. We didn't understand that it's hollow, that it's empty, that there is nothing substantial in these 5 aggregates of clinging. But meritorious disciples, if after hearing the Dhamma we try to analyze it, investigate it thoroughly, we have the ability to understand the reality of these 5 aggregates of clinging. That's why the Supreme Buddha explained in this sutta that these 5 aggregates of clinging, when investigated carefully, a person realizes that it's hollow, empty, and void. So meritorious disciples, I bless you. May you have the opportunity to contemplate, engage in wise consideration, and try to understand the reality of these 5 aggregates of clinging. And through that understanding, through that realization, may you have the opportunity to escape from this sorrowful samsara. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Namo Buddhaya.